I've titled this paper, The Shape of Indian Christian Apologetics. And right off the bat, I'll begin by admitting that this is not a totally original title, because in 1973, the great theologian Robin Boyd, the Christian theologian who wrote on Indian Christian theology, in 1973, he wrote a very short article called The Shape of Indian Christian Theology. And so I've kind of borrowed that title. Of course, the content is all very different, and I've adapted it and I'm calling it The Shape of Indian Christian Apologetics. Now, Protestant mission in India, it is said that Protestant mission in India has traditionally operated on two fronts. One front is evangelism, and the other front is education. And these two fronts, evangelism and education, they also operated at two different levels. The evangelistic work was among the lower groups of people, and the educational work was aimed at the upper classes. The reason the educational work was aimed at the upper classes was because missionaries in India, they saw education as the handmaiden of evangelism. And missionaries, they saw education as the most effective missionary technique, as it were. And the reason missionaries saw education as the most effective missionary technique was because they felt, and it was true, deep communication between a Westerner and an intelligent Hindu was considered impossible. And it was impossible because of the very radically different thought forms between the West and the Indian mind. And so, commenting on this missionary strategy, Duncan Forrester, he says this. Duncan Forrester was a missionary in India for a very long time, and then he returned to Scotland and became one of the world's greatest theologians at the University of Edinburgh. He passed away some years back. Duncan Forrester, who was both a missionary and a theologian, he says this: the solution that the missionaries offer the solution is to offer the Hindu an education as similar as possible to the missionaries' own education, so that the Hindu may be able to understand and appropriate the gospel. This reliance on Western education as a missionary method meant that many able missionaries of the first and second generations never really came in touch with Indian thought or the Hindu tradition at all. The college was a little Europe. The students were expected to become little Europeans in education, culture, and above all, in religion. Very interesting. Now, this comment by Duncan Forrester about the missionary method, it seems to me, it has a great deal of resonance with Indian Christian apologetics, because the educational institution, the missionary educational institution, became a Western colony, where the colonized, the Indians who were educated there, they were colonized, and they were educated in the thought forms of the colonizers. And the reason I find this thing to be to resonate with Indian Christian apologetics is because I believe that it is not too much of an exaggeration to say that a great deal of Indian Christian apologetics is a bit of a Western colony. And this, I would submit, is the first shape of Indian Christian apologetics, the shape of the colony. The apologetics that takes place in India today, and that has taken place for some years or decades, is conducted predominantly within the conceptual frameworks of Western apologetics. Most of its exponents, people like us, my colleagues, many people who are interested, maybe some of you who are interested in Christian apologetics, you are very conversant with the apologetics questions and issues that pertain to the West. And I can speak for myself, though I don't come from a Hindu background, and I'm not geographically mainland India. I'm an Indian. And I've lived in India. I've interacted with our Hindu friends for my whole life. But I cannot speak Hindi, forget about Sanskrit, and I've never given any systematic, sympathetic thought or effort to understand Hinduism or Hinduisms and its thought forms. I was always educated in English medium institution. My theological education was all Western education. And when I was doing my BD in UBS, my least liked subjects were Hinduism, Indian Christian theology, modern religious movements in India, and so on and so forth. And when I came to Christ in 1992 as a teenager, I was introduced to a lot of Christian apologetics and apologists, people like C.S. Lewis, Norman Geisler, Josh McDowell, Ravi Zacharias, J.P. Moreland, William Lane Craig. These were my heroes in Christian apologetics. And these were the people that I read and read voraciously. And in a sense, my mind got colonized and I became an embodiment of a Western apologetics colony personally. But as I traveled in India and worked with an apologetics ministry, I also found out that many churches in India, and especially churches that are interested in apologetics, but not just churches that are interested in apologetics, other churches, a lot of urban Indian churches and its members are also colonized and little colonies. What is more, the kind of training that we give, the kind of apologetics training that we give is very often just an extension of and a perpetuation of the Western colony. Now, frankly speaking, I cannot really think of anyone who is interested in Christian apologetics in India who is also deeply conversant with Hindu thought and Hindu thought forms. I can't. Maybe there are there, and I'm sure there are there in a lot of seminaries, or I know there are a lot of deep thinkers. But the problem is, I wouldn't say a problem, but could it be that these people who are very conversant in Hindu thought forms and bringing it into relation with the Christian gospel, is it maybe that they are not evangelical enough, or is it they are not evangelistic enough? I don't know, and I can't speak for it. But the thing is, when we look at about 200 years or so of in Indian Christian history, just the last 200 years, I know it goes way back, but even in the last 200 years, there were people, great people, with great minds, people like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, people like Keshav Chandra Sen. If you do a little bit of reading on them, you know that these people were giants. And I know they were not Christians, but they really were people who fell in love or who were spellbound and captivated by the personality of Jesus of Nazareth. And there were other people, people like Sadhu Sundar Singh, Pandita Ramabai, who were not necessarily theologians, and they were definitely not apologists, but they were also very deeply conversant with Hindu thought. Now, the second, among these people, there was, you can say that there is another, these people came up, not Raja Ram Mohan Roy or Keshav Chandra Sen, but what we can see is in the history of Indian Christian thought and its engagement with Hinduism, there is another shape that can be detected. I want to call this the shape of the combat. By combat, we mean an apologetic that takes the form of contesting, fighting, contradicting, and conflicting with a contrary belief system, and then contending for and commending the Christian faith instead. So this is the second shape. The first shape is the colony. The second shape is the combat. What do I mean by this? I'll explain what I mean by this by taking this man whom you have definitely heard of, Nilakanta Sastri Gore, Father Gore. Father Gore was someone who I mean, to my mind, he would have been probably the greatest Christian apologist doing apologetics, pure apologetics. He wrote a book called A Rational Refutation of the Hindu Philosophical Systems. And there he says, and it is as the title says, it is a rational refutation of the Hindu philosophical systems. Now, I've just taken out a passage from there. He says, on hearing that the Vedantins regard ignorance as the cause of the world's appearing to be true, one would of course suppose that this ignorance was understood by them not to be itself true. If ignorance did not actually exist, how could the world which they hold to be non-entity have appearance? When a man mistakenly sees a snake in a rope, the snake is called false. At the same time, that man's misapprehension is not said to be false, but true. The Vedantins, however, maintain that ignorance is false. We ought therefore to inquire how it is reckoned false and what is gained to the Vedanta system by so reckoning it. Now, if you didn't understand that, I don't blame you, because it is very dense. It is philosophically very rigorous. In fact, I was just reading this afternoon and scratching my head. So this is a form of apologetics that seeks to present the Christian gospel and to fight against other philosophical and religious systems. What are some of the pros of such an approach? Well, first of all, it is very impressive, philosophically, intellectually very impressive. And sometimes it is also necessary and it can be effective. So, for example, Pandita Ramabai. Pandita Ramabai was also not directly, but she was also influenced by Father Gore and in her journey to faith. And Pandita Ramabai, she says this, I think no one would have had the power of turning my heart from the Brahman religion but Father Gore. So this apologetics, this kind of very rigorous philosophical, intellectual apologetics, it has its pros. It does reach some people who are inclined that way. But there are some cons also, or some disadvantages. Well, first of all, such an approach is limited in a scale and its reach. It reaches a very select group of highly versed and intelligent and educated people, but it does not really appeal to the armed army or at the popular level. And the philosophical and intellectual rigor can also be a little overwhelming. And sometimes it can be too critical and polemical and not winsome enough. These are some of the cons, and one could add more. Now, related to this shape of the combat is what I call compare, contrast, or compete model. This is a kind of apologetic, and this is again very common in the West. I don't know if it's still very common, but it used to be a very common kind of an apologetic way. But it is an apologetic that compares, contrasts, and contradicts the doctrinal tenets of another religious tradition by placing them alongside those of Christianity. So it is an apologetic where different views on fundamental questions such as God, origins, humanity, sin, salvation, ethics, morality, identity, meaning, destiny, all of that, you compare what Christianity says about these things, and then you bring out what Hinduism or Islam or Buddhism or another religious tradition says about these things, and you compare and contrast. And of course, as Christian apologists, Christianity will always come out the winner. Compare and contrast. Now, we have this is 1893. We have a book called Christianity Explained to a Hindu, or Christianity and Hinduism Compared. Compared is the keyword. So we have had this kind of apologetics also, the comparison model, which is related to the combat model or shape. Now, I wouldn't read all of this, but such an approach is not altogether illegitimate, and it is sometimes necessary. But we must realize that the understanding of religion has changed drastically over the last few decades, and people have moved on. The study of religious studies has really moved on, and people have come to the point where they are saying it is not good enough to just lump together all religions together and name all of them religion, because they are completely different. You can't compare them. at all. That is where the status of religious studies is now. And so when we do apologetics in this way, comparing religions, then we are doing a kind of apologetics that with a very old-fashioned, outmoded, early man, almost early man kind of an apologetic, and we will get no hearing, and no serious scholar will take us seriously if we do this kind of apologetics. So we need to be careful. Now, this is the great missionary Leslie Newbegin. We must all read Leslie Newbegin. He is one of the greatest Christian thinkers ever, personally, I think. He says religions cannot be rightly understood by looking at them in terms of their distance from Christianity. Religions must be understood from within on their own terms. So you must be careful not to compare Hinduism and Christianity. You just try to understand Hinduism or Hinduisms or the religious traditions within Hinduism, try to understand them within their own terms. So that's a caution that Leslie Newbegin. Now, just as serious, informed, practicing Christians, they rightly feel misunderstood and misrepresented by people of other faiths or people of no faith. Serious, informed, practicing Hindus or Muslims will rightly feel the same when the same is done to them. Have you ever watched debates or even on television, some people talking about Christian faith, and you feel, oh, that's not Christianity, and you feel misrepresented? Many times we do the same without realizing. And that is um, and that is always a danger that besets apologetics. Christian apologists, we have been accused of and we have been rebuked for our tendency to create straw men rather than engaging in serious debate with serious positions. And we are often accused of ignoring details and nuances that do not fit our caricature of an opposing position. And that is a danger that besets this comparative model of doing apologetics. And this is a quote that I love by Richard Mao. I think he was president of Fuller. I love this quote. He says, an exclusive soteriological, missiological focus. And of course, since I'm speaking to theological students and theologians, I don't have to explain soteriological and missiological. But he says, an exclusive soteriological, missiological focus is itself attended by some important dangers. The most basic one is also spiritual in nature. And it is the real possibility that we will bear false witness against our Christian neighbors. In evangelization context, we rightly want to get people to see the inadequacy of their present religious commitments. But such a desire can also encourage us to portray those commitments of other religions in the worst possible light so that Christian belief and practice can clearly be seen as the better way. It is easy in such contexts to emphasize the negative aspects of the other perspective or even distort the positive elements of that perspective so that things are portrayed as worse than they really are. And he says, when we do that, when we misrepresent other religions, we are committing the sin of bearing false witness against our neighbors. Serious.